As we enter the new year, we've got 51 standard Warframes to collect from all over the game. Back in 2021, I covered how long it takes to farm up the blueprints for the RNG based frames, but that still skipped some important details. So today, let's cover every single Warframes farm from requirements and time gates to final resource gathering to see which frame really is the longest to farm. I'm the Engineer, let's solve a practical problem. Since mid-2021, we've seen Yareli, Caliban, Gyre, Stynax and Varuna all added into the mix, as well as changes to many other Warframes farms and requirements. Last time I skipped over Warframes that you purchase rather than directly farm, like Lavos and Zephyr, but I want to make this video much more comprehensive. To that end, I've given every Warframe a star rating to indicate just how long it'll take to get them. This is a combination of how advanced in the game you need to be to even begin to reliably farm their parts, as well as how long it'll take to actually obtain the parts, how much extra grinding you can expect to do for the resources to build them, and even any soft locks the game imposes on you, preventing you from making any progress until the game says otherwise. In total then, the higher the star rating, the more overall time and effort you'll spend before getting your hands on that Warframe. Unless you buy it for platinum, of course. Oh, and just a note, as I'm calling out every single Warframe, there will be some minor progression based spoilers in the later parts of this video. So brand new players, you've been warned. Without any further ado, let's start with the lowest tier of gameplay, the very early game. I'm defining very early game as basic star chart progression all the way up to Europa, with missions at most around level 20ish. Many new players will experience a bit of a shock on Saturn after dealing with the Corbus for 2 planets, so that's why I'm drawing the line there. For this very early game, it's 0 stars for progression required, as you basically don't need any. In fact, for the very first frames you can get, some are almost freely available. Almost. By joining an established clan, you'll be able to replicate the blueprints for Banshee, Nezha, Volt, Wukong and Zephyr, with no specific farming needed to get those blueprints, just the credit cost. It costs 80,000 credits to replicate the blueprints for just one of these Warframes, which isn't nothing for a brand new player, but it's still positively tiny overall. There's no real soft lock on accessing these blueprints, aside from constructing a clan dojo key, which you should be doing anyway, meaning the only real grind time is getting the resources to build these Warframes. Veterans may scoff at the idea of farming 400 plastids or a single neural sensor, but for a new player, it's unavoidable effort they need to do. Because of that, I'll rate all 5 of these Warframes 1 star for their grind time in order to actually pay for them. Outside of the clan dojo, there are a selection of very early game Warframes you can obtain through normal missions on the easier half of the star chart. All 7 of Excalibur, Frost, Mag, Necros, Nova, Rhino and Valkyr can be obtained from assassination missions scattered across those early planets. Unlike the dojo frames, you need to go out of your way to run the specific assassination mission multiple times over to get the parts you need. For most of everyone, this will only be 5 runs of a given assassination to get all of the parts. And so long as you have decent gear, or allies of a similar level joining your squad, those missions are quick to run as well. For that mission time, I'm rating it only half a star. This is RNG based though, so 5 runs will not be enough for over 40% of players, with 1 in 25 players needing more than 13 runs to finish off one of these Warframe sets, while 1 in 1,000 players can need more than 28 runs. Necros is slightly more forgiving out of these 7, but only to the point that the unlucky 1 in 1,000 would need just 20 plus runs, not necessarily 28 plus runs. Once again, being very early game frames means I wouldn't expect the newest players to just have the resources on hand for every single frame straight away. So on top of the half star to get the parts blueprint, I'm adding 1 star to the rating to get all the resources as well. Even if you already have all the resources you need, that just means you're already beyond being a 1 star tenno, so you've done your time, you've done the grind. Vauban is another very early game frame to acquire, but he's not from any specific mission. Instead, his parts are purchased from Nora Knight in the Nightwave shop. Nightwave is effectively Warframe's answer to a battle pass, except it's 100% free with no premium option, and front loads the very first level of the pass with 150 Nightwave creds, not to be confused with ordinary credits. Vauban's parts only require 75 creds, which means you just need to reach the first level, and then you can pick up the Vauban pieces just like that, and the main blueprint from the market for credits. For that reason, I'm putting it down as half a star grind time. A newer player can expect to have to put in some effort to actually get that first Nightwave level, due to not having the requirements for many challenges so early on. And once again, 1 star for resource gathering puts Vauban at 1.5 stars to farm. In the very early game, you'll also come across 2 quests which unlock Warframes for you too. The quest The Limbo Theorem pops up when you clear the Europa Junction. The quest itself is technically optional, although Limbo is a powerful, if unusual warframe, so it's definitely worth doing. Given the quest is specifically to get Limbo, awarding all 3 parts, I'm adding 1 star for the time spent doing that quest, and 1 star for the time spent to get the resources to build him as a very new player. This makes it 2 stars to get Limbo, with its main blueprint again just in the market for credits. The other very early game quest actually pops up a bit sooner if you want to, and that's the Wave Rider quest, which becomes available after completing the Vox Solaris quest on Venus. The Wave Rider unlocks the Yareli main blueprint, while the parts blueprints for Yareli can be replicated in an established clan's dojo in the Bash Lab. Just like Limbo's, this quest is optional and entirely to get Yareli, so that's 1 star for the quest, and then 1 star for the resource grind to build her. Finally, to wrap up the very early game warframes, we have our very first soft lock warframe, Nyx. Nyx is also farmed from assassinations like many of the other very early game frames, but you won't find her farm in a fixed or permanent location. She is farmed from the Forehead assassination, a mission which is only available when the game randomly and temporarily spawns an invasion on an assassination mode. These assassinations are pretty common, and while they're active, you can run the mission as much as you need to in order to get the full set of Nyx parts. Aside from this assassination sometimes not being available, Nyx's farm is otherwise identical to the other assassination frames, including having a main blueprint in the market for credits. She'll typically take up to 5 runs to get a complete set, and the Forehead is actually pretty quick to kill. Still, about 1 in 25 players will need more than 13 runs, and again 1 in 1,000 players will need more than 28 runs to get a complete set of Nyx. So in terms of total rating then, that's half a star for the typical mission time, 1 star for the soft lock that can happen if the game just doesn't give you the option to farm her when you want to, and 1 star for the resource grind for a very new player to actually be able to build her. This means for the last of the very early game frames, she sits at 2.5 stars. Before we move up a tier, I just want to be clear to any new players watching, very early game doesn't mean very weak frames. Every single warframe I've mentioned so far is capable, with some of them being the absolute best picks for the variety of content. You can very easily play the entire game without issue with just these very early game warframes. I'm only calling them very early game based on when you can get them. Having completed enough of Europa, we're pushing up a tier into Saturn and beyond, entering the early game. Yeah, that's right, we're going from very early to just early game. It's still only the basic star chart after all. On Saturn and Neptune are 2 simple enough assassination missions, which once again give out warframe parts, this time for Ember and Loki. Back on Earth, a similar assassination also opens up, rewarding Hydroid. I've lumped in the Vahek assassination on Earth here because the difficulty of that mission is definitely beyond most very early game players. All 3 of these missions drop the component parts just like earlier assassinations, meaning most players will only need to run 5 short runs, and the really unlucky, maybe a couple dozen runs. So long as you're appropriately geared, you can farm each set in well under an hour, and probably under half an hour. So for these 3 frames, I'm scoring them 1 star for being early game tier, half a star for the actual mission time, and half a star for the resource grind, as an early game player may well still need to pick up a few resources here or there to finish their construction. At 2 stars, these are still easy to achieve frames. As we progress from here, more and more steps are required for each new warframe. Mirage and Titania are obtained through quests. Both of them give you all the parts blueprints in the quest, with Mirage's main blueprint found in the market for a few credits, while Titania's main blueprint is also awarded from her quest. Being early game tier, we can give both of these warframes 1 star for that, and 1 star for the quest, as well as half a star for the resource requirements to construct those frames. Otherwise, there's no additional farming needed for them. I'm still going to keep popping on that half star for build requirements throughout the early game, as the newest of you watching will still find gaps in your inventory, especially if you speed through these requirements. At the end of the star chart is the farm for Saryn. She's from an assassination mission, like many before her, but she's also locked behind acquiring judgment points, which you get from other missions before you can even tackle her own mission. There's no quest in the way, and the number of reruns is just like other assassination-based frames, but that extra requirement means she does take a bit longer than Loki or Hydroid. Adding together the tier, the runs and the resource costs, that pushes her to 2.5 stars. Atlas is another assassination-based frame, but his assassination is locked behind the optional quest, the Jordis Precept. It's optional because you don't need it for any other progression other than unlocking Atlas, so we'll count that against his farm. Atlas's farm also involves an Arcwing section, which is a struggle if you're using an improperly modded starter archgun, the Imperator. My advice? Don't do that. Grab pretty much any different archgun, slap on Rubedo line barrel, and a couple mods to make the damage corrosive. All of that is really easy to achieve and makes this mission frankly very easy to run. So assuming you're not being silly about this farm, that means we've got 1 star for the tier, 1 star for the quest, half a star for the actual farm, and then half a star for the resource grind to build Atlas afterwards. This makes Atlas our first 3-star farm as a result of the increasing requirements. Speaking of requirements, we can also pop back to Earth to look at Gara. Gara's also got an associated quest in Sire's Vigil as it awards her main blueprint. However, that quest is necessary for other parts of the game, so I won't really count it against Gara. Her parts blueprints are the bigger hurdle. Gara is farmed from tier 1, 2 and 3 bounties on the plains of Eidolon, the tier 3 being level 20 to 40 missions, making it more than a very early game player could handle. On top of this, the time actually taken to run the bounties can be quite significant. With the split drop tables, most players will need half a dozen or more of these bounties to get her full set, taking up to an hour. For unluckier players, this can take a couple hours, or even more if you're undergeared. Even once you've got Gara's parts, you then need to get hold of the resources, many of which are specific to the plains of Eidolon, demanding you go mining, fishing, and then crafting the materials. So there's a star added on for farming the parts, a star for the materials, and the star for the tier, making Gara a clear 3-star frame, even if everything goes smoothly. By the time you're farming these 3-star frames, you'll also have completed the quest The New Strange, and a few junctions afterwards which will give you all of the blueprints for Chroma. Rather than having his own assassination mission, Chroma's construction requires parts from other warframes, mostly found behind assassinations. Ember's Neuroptics from Saturn, Frost Chassis from Ceres, and Saryn systems from Sedna, on top of the Vault Neuroptics from your clan Dojo. Individually, these aren't terribly hard to get, but the combined time definitely does begin to add up. So Chroma scores 1 star for the tier, as you need to be able to access Sedna, and half a star for the time spent on the quest, reducing it down a bit because you're still going to do the quest anyway for the star chart. Add onto this 1.5 stars to go ahead and grab all 4 components from other warframes, and then to build those, and you can see how Chroma becomes a 3-star grind. On Uranus, we find our final 3-star warframe, which is Equinox. She's not got a quest lock or anything like that, but instead she has a staggering 8 pieces to obtain from the assassination mission. The mission itself isn't that hard, but facing off against the RNG means even the average player will run that mission 20 times over just to get a full set. 1 in 20 players will need twice as many runs, with nearly 1 in 1,000 players reaching 70 runs without finishing. Even if you're running really quickly, that's about an hour for the average person, and a few hours if you're slower or less lucky. For that reason, Equinox has 1 star from the tier, 1.5 stars from the mission alone, and then an extra half a star for the time a player will need to spend to actually build Equinox. It's not the worst farm, still early game, but it is tedious and at the mercy of RNG. Now Trinity is far more tedious than Equinox for farming. She's again another assassination based frame, another one with only 3 parts, so again Trinity is one where most players would only need about 5 runs to be done with her. The problem for Trinity, however, is twofold. The Pluto assassination she's locked behind also requires you to first farm Animo nav beacons by farming other Pluto missions. Then when you get into the assassination, it's one of the longer missions when optimized, taking about 12 minutes each time. You can't just invest in a faster warframe to speed up the level substantially, so Trinity's mission is very much a hurry up and wait assassination. As a result of this, despite the low cost to build, average players can expect to spend over an hour on this farm, and the unlucky a lot more, earning Trinity a full 2 stars for the mission time on top of the 1 star from her tier and half a star to wrap up the resource cost. I'll be honest, I can assume that most players attempting her farm have probably put it off long enough to end up having the resources, but that's just farming in a different order. As we're beginning to exhaust the assassination missions, we might get an inbox notification. Baruuk arrives every 2 weeks and always stocks the blueprint to get started on the quest Sands of Inaros. As you might expect, this quest rewards you with everything you need to build Inaros. I'm putting Inaros into the early game tier, partly because you need to get enough ducats to actually get the blueprint, partly to be able to actually do the quest requirements, and then also because you need to access the relay that Barrow is visiting. Sure, there are some lower level relays he does visit, but it's still a barrier if he visits a higher tier relay, and you need Mastery 5 to even start the quest anyway. So on top of the 1 star from the tier to access the quest, we can put 1 star for the softlock of waiting for Barrow to arrive, 1 star for completing the quest itself, and then half a star to round off any resource requirements you may still have at the end of the quest to build up Inaros fully. We're nearly at the end of the early game for farming Warframes, which leads us to the second to last assassination based Warframe, Mesa. Just like with Inaros, Mesa is more than just getting the parts, and you first have a whole quest to do, Patient Zero. Once you've done that, you then need to get the materials to build keys to unlock access to the fight to actually try to get the Mesa parts. Like most assassinations, this is typically going to require about 5 runs, which means about 5 keys. Those keys are the Mutalist Alad V Assassinate keys, made using Mutalist Alad V nav coordinates. And those coordinates can either be obtained by gambling on some unforgiving mission drops, or you can get them from invasion rewards. While the invasions are the more preferable option, they have the same issue as the Forid for farming Nyx, in that they're not always available. Effectively, this is a soft lock on farming Mesa unless you slog away at the even worse farms on Deimos. Even when the invasion pops up and you run it 3 times, this will only give you 1 coordinate, and then only when the invasion is defeated. To make this farm easier, you'll want to find other players to share your key with. When you squad up with others, only the host's key will be used on starting this mission, reducing the drain on a 4-player squad as you can each take turns hosting and using a key. Otherwise, you've got a long road ahead of you. I know there were a lot of comments on my previous video about me not giving enough weight to this roadblock for Mesa, so this is me correcting that mistake. All told then, that's 1 star for Mesa's tier, all the way up on Eris, 1 star for the time spent getting the keys and the quick assassination, 2 stars for the soft locks on invasion payouts, and an extra half star to wrap up the construction cost for building her, totaling 4.5 stars for Mesa. There are not a lot of frames where I'd seriously recommend finding people to help you out, but this is definitely one of them. Breaking away from assassinations, one early game frame is instead scattered across the star chart spy missions. Ivara's parts are split up, with her systems dropping from spy missions on Mercury to Phobos, her chassis on Ceres to Saturn as well as Lua, while her neuroptics and main blueprint come from the spy missions on Uranus or later planets. There's no specific quest you have to do, and no crazy requirements or softlocks, but having her parts split up on different spy missions means you'll definitely be running more than a few. The average player will need to run over 40 missions, with even moderately unlucky players having to do over 100 spy missions. Because of the number of missions you'll require, farming up a spy frame like Wukong or Loki first is highly advisable to make these as quick as possible. Because of the number of missions this will take, this gives Ivara a full 3 stars for mission time, on top of 1 star for the tier, and the resource cost half a star, bringing her total to 4.5 stars to grind out. And then our final frame of the early game is Octavia. She's locked behind her own optional quest, Octavia's Anthem, but this quest doesn't give you any of the parts blueprints to build her. Instead, 1 part can be obtained by doing the common music puzzle on Lua, another by finding caches on Lua's Exterminate mission, and then the big grind is getting her neuroptics. That part is locked behind rotation C of Survivor on Deimos, meaning you need to spend 20 minutes surviving there for a chance at getting the part you need. If it doesn't drop, there is no pity system, you've just got to do it again. So taking into account the tier of play, the quest, the mission farm time, and the significantly higher resource cost than every other frame so far at this tier, this racks up 5 stars of grind for Octavia. So while Octavia is only early game in terms of difficulty, the grind for her is very real. And so we mark our entry into the mid-game. Mid-game play unlocks Railjack, Necromech and Operator, but doesn't include doing the quest The New War, and otherwise represents players who've not yet reached the higher levels of intrinsics or faction grinds. Having reached this tier, the first frame we can talk about is Lavos. On the surface, he seems to have relatively gentle requirements, only needing rank 3 with the Entrati Syndicate, and then you just buy his blueprints from them for standing. Sure, you also need to pick up a couple mining blueprints, but that's again just a little bit more standing and mining time. But sealed away in the requirements to build him is 2,000 titanium, and not tiny amounts of other resources. To get titanium, you need to do Railjack, and while you can get into Railjack missions without a Railjack yourself, technically that's being carried by a high level player, which I want to avoid in this overview. For that reason, I'm putting Lavos into the mid-game, giving him 2 stars for being a mid-game frame, along with 1 star for the standing to buy his component parts, and 1 star to get the specific resources, including the mining ones. He's still just a 4-star grind, but he is a mid-game grind. Another open world frame I'm marking as mid-game is Revenant. In order to unlock Revenant, you must complete the quest Mask of the Revenant, which itself requires the War Within quest, putting this into the mid-game of progression. The quest only awards his main blueprint, demanding you to get his parts from tier 3, 4 and 5 Caesar's bounties yourself before or during the quest. Most players can expect to spend over an hour getting Revenant's parts across at least 7 bounties run, with 1 in 20 players needing over 16 bounties, and 1 in 1,000 players needing over 30 bounties to complete the set. Thankfully, the resource requirements are things that by the time you're actively farming Revenant, you should already have all of it covered, or at most a few minutes to top up. This means Revenant is 2-star for his tier, and 2 stars for the quest and bounty grind, making him also a 4-star grind in the mid-game. Looking instead to Railjack, the earlier stages of that gives you access to Oberon. He's locked behind running Grineer Railjack missions on Earth and Saturn Proxima, only demanding level 3 intrinsics to be able to start the missions, but also a decent bit of gear to survive them compared to the star chart. His systems and neuroptics are earned from Earth Proxima by completing Grineer points of interest like disabling the pulse turbine. His chassis on the other hand is from doing the same thing but on Saturn Proxima. Having simulated this farm with 4-minute mission times, which is plenty doable, half of everyone can farm up Oberon's parts within 22 missions, taking about 1.5 hours. Around 1 in 20 people will need over 50 missions, and 1 in 1,000 people over 90 of these Railjack missions. For this reason, I'm scoring him 2 stars for tier and 2 stars for the grind time. His resource costs on the other hand are laughably low, as Oberon used to be accessible much earlier in the game years ago. So by the time you're farming Oberon, you should definitely be able to build him without any concern. Coming back to the normal star chart, progressing into the mid-game of quests also opens up the final assassination mission, the Rope-Below list. This funky boss fight, notorious more for its bugs than its actual mechanics, is the source of Wisp. Unlike the other assassination missions, this one awards not only Wisp's parts, but also her main blueprint, meaning you'll need extra runs of this mission to complete the set. You will also find yourself in need of at least a semi-decent amp if you don't want to be spending forever in the mission. All told then, that's typically up to 7 runs for most players to finish a set, with 1 in 20 needing over 16 runs, or 1 in 1,000 players needing over 30 runs. While for more advanced players this can be a quick fight, I'm rating the Rope-Below list at 2 stars for the tier, and 1.5 stars for the mission time. On top of this, Wisp demands a large amount of Hexanon and Oxium to construct. From my recent survey of players, the vast majority of those who could farm up Wisp but had yet to get her, do not have these resources on hand, adding an extra star for that resource grind, bringing Wisp up to 4.5 stars. Swinging back to Venus, I've so far not mentioned Garuda. Her main blueprint you get really early on by doing the Vox Solaris quest, and her parts are only locked behind tier 1 to 3 bounties on the Orb Valis. That said, those enemies tend to punch above their level in the first place. Not only that, even when you've got Garuda's parts, you're then met with some exotic build requirements compared to how early the quest is. 3,500 Kuva, 6 toroids, and gems taking you as far as rank 4 with the Solaris United to obtain the crafting blueprints. Individually, these could be skirted around, but all combined, it'll be unfair to call her requirements early game. In total, this gives us 2 stars for the tier, 1 star for the actual parts grind, with the average person only needing to run 5 bounties, and then 2 stars for the resource grind to actually get her built. All combined, Garuda sits solidly at 5 stars. Our next 2 Warframes also come online in the mid-game on other parts of the star chart. Harrow's main blueprint is locked behind the Chains of Harrow quest, while Nidus' main blueprint is locked behind the Glassed Gambit quest, both of which take place after the War Within. For Harrow, his pieces are scattered, with neuroptics available from Kuva's Spy or Rotation C of Kuva Survival, his systems from Rotation B and C of Defection, or again Rotation C of Kuva Survival, and his chassis, well, you already have his chassis. Doing Defection and Spy will take the average player 15 missions for about 2 hours of mission time, while doing Kuva Survival for the parts will take 10 Rotation Cs on average, which is over 3 hours. As for Nidus, his parts are farmed solely from the Infested Salvage mission on Eris, with all 3 parts only available on Rotation C, typically taking about 12 minutes to get there. This means for an average player, it will take 11 rounds or over 2 hours to get all Nidus parts. For both Nidus and Harrow, 1 in 20 people will be looking at over 5 hours of efficient farming, so all told, these 2 frames have 2-star requirements to access and 3 stars for their mission times. All told then, Nidus and Harrow are 5-star grinds. But the rating doesn't stop at 5 stars. Dotted around the star chart are a few missions which punch well above their level, mostly being the Disruption missions. Gauss is farmed from one of the highest of these Disruption missions found on Sedna. While it's technically accessible without having to do the War Within, no early game player is going to handle that mission gracefully, making this at least a mid-game farm. The parts for Gauss drop from Rotation C, though that reward table is much more accessible than with most endless mission types. For this then, the typical player would need 20 Rotation C rounds to get a complete Gauss set, which is not even 2 hours if you're quick at running. Though again, our unlucky 1 in 20 will need over 50 runs, or over 100 runs for 1 in 1,000 players. Even once you get his parts, Gauss's build requirements include gems from rank 4 of both Solaris United and Neostrons, adding even more time to get the materials and the ability to craft them. You could skip this last bit by trading for the gems from other players, but that's once again being carried by someone further into the game. So not accounting for that option then, this is a 2-star progression requirement, a 2-star mission time for farming, and a 2-star demand for resources that you'll need to go out of your way to sort out. Gauss ticks all the boxes for our first 6-star grind. On a similar vein is a Warframe whose main blueprint becomes available far earlier than she could be reasonably constructed, and that is Protea. The quest The Deadlock Protocol is an early game quest, but running the Granum Void to get her parts isn't so easily embarked on. Not only that, Protea's build requirements include carbides, cubic diodes and titanium, which you're only going to get in worthwhile quantities through railjack missions. Within the Granum Void, each Protea part has a 1 in 9 drop chance, but each of them are from a different tier of Granum Void, meaning that even an average luck player will need 24 Granum Voids to get everything, and that's already a couple hours of farming. 1 in 20 players will need over 55 runs, and the unmitigated RNG just gets even sillier beyond that. So with a combination of a mid-game set of requirements for 2 stars, a clear 3-star mission grind, and an extra 1 star to gather resources you need once you've got to that tier, I'm rating Protea as a 6-star grind, just like Gauss. This leaves us with one final Warframe before you progress into the late game of Warframe's progression system. You can actually unlock the ability to begin farming this one a little bit earlier on, but the efficiency demands to reach Rotation C really hold this one back to being a mid-game farm. This frame I'm talking about is Khora, farmed from Sanctuary Onslaught. She's a legendary farm, not only to get her parts, which is an ordeal in itself, but also because she requires Kavat genetic codes. Ignoring buying them for Platinum, those codes drop only 25% of the time from scanning live Kavats on Deimos missions in the Orokin Terralic tileset. The only saving grace to getting Khora is that Sanctuary Onslaught is desirable for reasons other than farming her parts, meaning a lot of players do kind of end up having many other pieces, if not a whole set. Still, farming from 0 will take a typical player just over 5 hours, with 1 in 20 players needing to do around 13 hours of Sanctuary Onslaught just to get those parts. This is due to the fact that while her parts are split over rotations A, B and C, she's got 2 blueprints on rotation C, yet only 1 of them on rotation A. Khora is a serious grind, scoring 2 stars for the progression to actually be capable of farming her yourself, 4 stars for the mission time, and 2 stars for the additional resource grind on top, meaning Khora rounds off the top of the mid-game frames at an eye-watering 8 stars of grind. Yeah, she's a beast. So now we can talk about the late-game Warframes. Just being late game doesn't make them long to farm, it just means they either demand completion of the quest The New War, or otherwise have a similar level of progression block. On completing the New War and Angels of Zariman quest, just 5 more mission nodes open up, and then you've completed the entire star chart, granting you access to arbitrations. This opens up the farm for Grendel. Unlike many farms, his is mostly not restricted by RNG. You need to farm up Vitus Essence from arbitrations, and use that to purchase locators to access Grendel's unique missions. These are not the easiest missions, as most of your options, including mods and operator, are disabled. However, with a solid picker like Lavos or Protea, or the help of friends on the same grind as you, the missions can be handled easily. The thing with the locators is, just like with Mesa, only the host key is consumed. For this reason, I strongly recommend finding 2 other people who are farming Grendel and work together to share the load, both for Vitus Essence and for the mission itself. Considering all that then, Grendel gets 3 stars for being a late game farm, and 2.5 stars for the farm time, as it's still 20 minutes of survival, 10 waves of defense, and 800 cryotic, all without your normal gear. If you're fully solo, you can probably add on an extra star here, but for the general case, I'm rating Grendel at just 5.5 stars. His resource costs are absolutely not a problem for a late game player. Late game also means starting to refine your gear for various mission types, making higher level railjack missions achievable. This opens up farms for both Sevagoth and Ash. Sevagoth is obtained exclusively through Voidstorm missions as a bonus reward for completing them, dropping each part 10% of the time for any of Neptune, Pluto or Veil Voidstorms. Those missions are not the easiest, nor the shortest if you choose the Corpus ones, given the priority objectives you have to do before you even embark on the Corpus ship. The average player will need to complete 16 Void Storms to completely farm Sevagoth, taking around a couple hours. 1 in 20 players will need over 39 Void Storms, and 1 in 1,000 will be doing over 76 runs. Ash's farm is similar to Sevagoth, and indeed farmable simultaneously sometimes by doing Corpus Railjack missions such as Defense or Survival up to Rotation A, or with lower drop rates from Volatile or Exterminate. Ash's systems come from Venus Proxima, Neuroptics from Neptune Proxima, and the chassis from Pluto Proxima. At the time of my original video on this topic, his farm was substantially worse, but DE have reduced this significantly, so the average player farming Ash will need around 2.5 hours for his parts, not the 13 hours he needed before. That said, it is still quite the chunk of time. So for both of these frames then, I can rate them 3 stars just for the progression you need to try to farm them, and then 3 stars for the time they'll take actually doing the missions, bringing them both to a 6-star grind. Returning to the star chart once more, we can head back to Fortuna. Fortuna's standing grind is notorious, so being able to rank up with Voxelaris is something I'm confident at rating late game grind wise. In ranking up with them, you'll unlock the Warframes Baruuk and Hildryn. Of the two, Baruuk is slightly more forgiving as all of his blueprints are available for standing from Little Duck. This does mean farming up Toroids or Narmer Isoplast in order to actually get his pieces though. Once you're established into the late game, you should be able to do that handily enough, such as by facing off against Prophet Taker for 6,000 standing with every kill. On top of this however, Baruuk also requires the lower tier Toroids to construct, in addition to mining materials that, according to my survey, most players able and in need of farming Baruuk simply do not have a stockpile of. So with 3 stars for the late game tier, 1 star for some reasonably quick Prophet Taker runs, and then 2 stars to go out of your way to get the resources needed, Baruuk sits squarely at 6 stars of grind. Hildryn's main blueprint also comes from Little Duck, again a standing in rank demand with Voxelaris. However, Hildryn's components are arguably worse. All 3 pieces drop from the boss fight against the Exploiter Orb on the Orb Valis. This fight is an experience in itself, to put it gently, but at least it follows the same drop rate as normal assassination missions, requiring most players to only do a few runs to get all the parts. Well, that would be true if it weren't for the build requirements. Building Hildryn requires 6 Lazulite Toroids which, without boost, only drop 1 at a time from the Exploiter Orb, meaning you will have to fight it at least 6 times to build Hildryn anyway. As a result, this will take about 1 to 1.5 hours for the average player. This is on top of the standing with Little Duck and a handful of other resources. Just to push it that little bit further, the Exploiter Orb also requires a Key of Swords to access. You can only start the fight by having someone in the squad spend 1 diluted Thermia, and the only source of diluted Thermia is from Thermia Fractures event, which only appears from time to time. If it's not active, you can't get Thermia, and therefore you either rely on someone else who did do it, or you just can't farm Hildryn. This means we've got 3 stars for the tier, 1.5 stars for the mission time, 1 star for the extra resource grinds overall, and then 1 star for the softlock from the Thermia Fractures event. All considered, Hildryn is a 6.5 star grind. Now at first glance, you'd be forgiven for thinking only those 2 frames were tied up in late game Fortuna, but there's actually a 3rd frame for an entirely different planet. I'm talking about the broken Warframe, Zaku. Their components are farmed from tier 2, 4 and 5 bounties on Deimos, which itself is both a challenge for mid-game players and a grind of over an hour for someone with average luck. Most people will need to run 8 bounties, with again 1 in 20 people needing over 17 bounties, or 1 in 1,000 players needing over 31 bounties. But the parts are just the start of their grind. Zaku requires Scintillant, a somewhat painful Deimos resource, on top of gems and ores and other assorted bits from that open world. Zaku requires Escher Devar and Breath of the Eidolon from the Plains of Eidolon, though that's not too terrible to get late game. But then Zaku also requires Gyromag systems, which themselves require reaching rank 5 with the Solaris United and farming them from Prophet Taker bounties. This means that Zaku is pushed into the late game overall for 3 stars on progression, 1.5 stars for the mission time to get their parts, and a further 2 stars to get the materials they need, totaling 6.5 stars worth of effort. Yet more recent Warframes managed to take this even further though. After completing the Angels of Zariman, you'll unlock the ability to farm up Gyre from the various bounties on the Zariman. I covered this in more detail in the video on how long it takes to get everything on the Zariman, but the basic gist is that your fastest mission time will come from cherry picking the Exterminate bounties. You'll need to do Tier 1 bounties for Gyre's new optics, Tier 2 for chassis, Tier 3 for systems, and then either Tier 4 or 5 for the main blueprint. Gyre also requires resources unique to the Zariman missions, but it turns out that so long as you're somewhat reasonably looting the map as you go, like using an AoE weapon or carrier, most players should cross the resource requirements off before getting a full set of Gyre, so that's not as much of a concern. The average player focused on Exterminate bounties will get a full set of Gyre in just over 2 hours of mission time at an efficient pace. But if we're being fair about this, you can't rely on the Exterminate bounty to always be the right bounty for you. Because of this, you either run a slower bounty, or you take a self-inflicted softlock on waiting for a better bounty to roll around. Because of this, I'm rating Gyre 3 stars for the late game mission, 3 stars for the actual mission time, and an extra 1 star for the choice of an even longer mission or self-imposed softlock. This means Gyre sits at 7 stars for the grind. Also available after Angels of Zariman is Varuna. You can farm Varuna's parts in the mid-game if you're stubborn enough, as that's when the conjunction survival missions become available on Lua. However, Varuna's build requirements include Void Gel Orbs, which are only obtainable in the game on Zariman. Even setting that aside, Varuna's farm may be a fair one in terms of having a pity system, but she's still going to take no small amount of mission time due to her parts being locked behind either Rotation C of the Conjunction Survival mission, or otherwise gathering enough Lua Thraxplasm to buy her parts. And again, you can only do that on the Zariman. So most players will need over 3 hours to farm Varuna, including the Lua Thraxplasm. After getting those blueprints, you then need to get the other resources, which includes 20 somatic fibers, a grind in itself. Taking that into account, that's 3 stars for being a late game farm, 3 stars for the time spent just getting the parts, and a further 2 stars just to finish getting the resources you need, rating Varuna as an 8-star farm in total, matching the rating I've given to Khora. But there are 2 yet higher rated warframes than that left to go. Completing the new war opens up Nama bounties on the plains of Eidolon and the Orb Valis, and these are the sole source of parts blueprints for Caliban. Unlike other bounty-based frames, however, you cannot get all of Caliban's parts at any given time. Each one of them is on its own drop table, and the bounty drop tables change every 2.5 hours, meaning if you get the timing just wrong, it can be 5 hours before the Caliban part you need is back in rotation to get. Even when you do run a bounty, you have a 26.2% chance of getting a Caliban part during the bounty, or 31.7% if you do all bonus objectives, which is quite far from guaranteed. Just getting the parts will take the average player nearly 2 hours of mission time. On top of this, Caliban also requires more Nama Isoplast than you'll receive just getting the blueprints. In addition to this, Caliban needs anomaly shards, which only drop from the Sentient anomaly, found in Grenier, Vale and Railjack missions, pretty much the exact opposite side of the game from the open world bounties. Based on my survey of players, not even counting the Nama Isoplasts, less than 1 in 7 people having reached the point of needing to and being able to farm Caliban actually have the other resources on hand to build him as soon as they get the parts. So for Caliban, this means 3 stars for the late game tier, 2 stars for the mission time for parts, 2 stars for the extra resources to farm, and I'm adding on 2 stars for the softlock that the bounties can just not be available. I think I'm fair in assessing Caliban as a 9-star farm. And so finally then, after all else is said and done, once you've completed the Veilbreaker quest, we find ourselves looking at the process needed to get Styanax. The quest doesn't give you any part of him, as all 4 of his blueprints are locked behind completing the Carl missions for stock. Each Carl mission pays out a maximum of 105 stock if you do every challenge, and completing the mission for the week will also rank up Carl's garrison once, to a max of 5 over the course of 4 weeks. As Styanax requires rank 5 for you to buy the main blueprint, that's a 3-week softlock already built in that you can only begin after the Veilbreaker quest. The total cost of Styanax's blueprints is 270 stock, meaning you could get him straight away upon completing the 4th Carl mission, though this comes at the cost of not being able to pick up the Archon mods or other weapon blueprints available with Carl. It's your choice, either delay Styanax or delay something else. Once you've got the blueprints, you still need to build Styanax. He needs Encharted Lanthorns, Thraxplasm and Voidplume Quills from the Zariman. He needs Star Crimson and Radiant Centirum from Cetus. He needs Hespersim Alloy from Fortuna, and Purged Agonic from the Cambion Drift. So that is a late game farm for 3 stars, 2 stars for the time spent on Carl missions, 3 stars on the 3-week softlock, and then 2 more stars for the extra resource grind on top, across all of the open worlds. It's no surprise that D handed out Stylax for free for a while on release, because this Warframe ends up being the only Warframe on the entire roster that I would rate a full 10 stars for the time it takes to get him. The only saving grace is that he's at least not locked behind any real RNG, but this just means that everyone's got the same delay to deal with. In fact, I'd go so far as to say, if an experienced player started a new account, they could farm up every other Warframe in the time it takes Stylax to become an option. And that, my esteemed Tenno, is the frame that takes the longest to farm as we enter 2023. I hope this gives you a very comprehensive look into what every Warframe takes to get, including the wider factors beyond just getting the individual blueprints. In any case, that's all from me for now though, so as always, gather resources, farm frames, and fight well, Tenno.